Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 780 of People Behind the Science. Today, we are excited to be resharing our conversation with Dr. Allison Okamura. Listeners, Allison's lab studies 3 different areas of robotics. The first is haptics, which involves human-machine interactions through the sense of touch. The second area is designing medical robots. These can, for example, be used to help people recover from stroke or perform a surgery. And the third area of her research is creating soft robots that can conform to their environments. And in our interview, we talk more about the phenomenal research that Allison does, as well as her career path and life outside the lab. So I hope you enjoy this episode of People Behind the Science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the People Behind the Science podcast. Today, I am delighted to introduce you to our guest researcher, Dr. Allison Okamura. So, Allison, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. We are excited to chat with you about your life and your science. But before we dive into all of those details, let me first start by telling our listeners a little bit about your background. Allison is a professor of mechanical engineering at Stanford University. She also holds a courtesy appointment in computer science there. Allison received her bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from the University of California, Berkeley, and she was awarded her master's and Ph.D. degrees both in mechanical engineering from Stanford University. Now, before joining the faculty there at Stanford, Allison was professor and vice chair of mechanical engineering at Johns Hopkins University. Allison has received numerous awards and honors throughout her career, including being elected as a fellow for the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, or IEEE. She's also been awarded the IEEE Technical Committee on Haptics Early Career Award, the IEEE Robotics and Automation Society Early Academic Career Award, as well as an NSF CAREER Award. In addition, Allison was honored as a Duca Family University Fellow in Undergraduate Education, a Robert Bosch Faculty Scholar, a Gabilan Fellow, and an Alumni Distinguished Scholar by Stanford University, as well as a Decker Faculty Scholar by Johns Hopkins University. Now, Allison, we're excited to learn more about your experiences both in and outside of science and engineering. So can you start by telling us a little bit more about you as a person and your non-scientific life?
My non-scientific life is very active. I have a husband who's also at Stanford University as a lecturer and 2 kids, a daughter who's 13 and a son who's 8. So my life mostly revolves around my family. That said, I really like to do various sports. I run, I play ice hockey, and definitely I enjoy doing things other than working in the lab.
I love it. And I don't hear from too many people who are sort of avid hockey players. So how did you get into hockey?
I started playing hockey actually because I met other women engineers who played way back when I was a graduate student, and they got me into it. I had roller skated a lot as a kid. Growing up in California, there were no ice rinks in my hometown, so I had to move to ice hockey kind of later in life.
I'm a miserable skater, so it looks like so much fun, but I don't think I could do it.
Oh, it's great. When you have the stick, it's like a third leg.
I love it. Well, Allison, great to get a window into your life outside of science, but I would love to talk about your research next. So how do you describe what you do to someone who maybe isn't familiar with your area of engineering?
Well, my field in general is robotics. So most people in the public kind of have an idea of what that means, although the specifics of what I do are probably different from what most people see in the movies about robots. So there are 3 areas that we work in. One area is haptics, which is human-machine interaction through the sense of touch. Another is medical robots. So being able to create robots that help people, for example, recover from stroke, or a robot that can be used in surgery to make it more minimally invasive. And then the third area, which is relatively recent for our lab, is soft robots. So thinking about how you can have robots which conform to the environment or safe around people using soft materials.
Very cool. Well, I'm excited to chat about some of these projects that you're working on as we go through our interview today. And I think you've got so many cool things going on in the lab that your research in and of itself can be enough motivation to get you excited to go to the lab every day. But I love getting little quotes and tidbits of motivation and inspiration from everybody that I talk to. So Allison, do you have a favorite quote or a saying that really resonates with you?
Well, this is a pretty geeky quote, but my favorite quote when I think about research and how to do it is that all models are wrong, but some are useful. And the meaning of that is simply that in engineering and science, we're always trying to write down equations essentially that describe the world. And we have to recognize that they all fall short of reality, which is incredibly complex. But we have to do it because we need to build some kind of understanding of the world in order to design for it. So the idea is that all the models are inherently wrong in some way, but we need to figure out how to make them useful.
I like this. I hadn't heard it before, but I like how it sort of acknowledges that science isn't perfect, but you have to take these steps forward and science can help us get there.
Exactly.
Well, that is an awesome quote. And I'd love to chat with you a little bit more next about maybe some of the people who had an impact on you. So do you have particular role models or inspirational figures that you've looked up to?
Oh, there's so many people in my life who have helped me, who've mentored me, who've been a sponsor. But I would say, and I'm sure many people probably say this going back, that my biggest inspiration would really be my parents. I'm a mechanical engineer and my parents are both chemists. So they're more basic scientists than I. And I think what they inspired me was not so much in what they did specifically in science, but just how they live their lives. They enjoy life, they like to have fun, but they also enjoy their work, enjoy discovery, enjoy teaching and working with students. So they work hard and they think really critically about what they do, but they also always cared about people. So for me, in terms of having an academic career, although it wasn't always my goal, looking back now, it almost seems inevitable because I had my mom and my dad to inspire me because they were professors and scientists.
I love it. And it sounds like you almost had a role model too in how to balance everything in life. I think academics sometimes struggle separating the rest of their life from their work and kind of balancing family and their hobbies and their interests. So do you think having your parents as academics helped you maintain that balance?
I think so, because I did have a template, an example for how it could be done. And I think the other thing, especially important to note, is my mom and her generation being one of so few women in her field, getting a Ph.D. in chemistry was just extremely unusual for women. So because of her, although I'd like to say you'd never think you couldn't do it, I definitely had many times where I thought I couldn't do it. Mm-hmm. There was an example of someone who had really succeeded in higher education and in a teaching career at a time when it was even more difficult than it is today.
That is awesome. So it sounds like you were exposed to science and maybe the laboratory at a very early age. Do you have an early memory of when you first started getting interested in science or maybe starting to think about it as a career?
I guess I've always had so many different interests. And I think one of the interesting things for me is that I feel like I wasn't necessarily destined to do science or engineering. I like to do a lot of different things. Mm-hmm. But I do think in general, growing up, I enjoyed school in general. Right? I enjoyed the academic life. I enjoyed learning things. So maybe it wasn't even so much specifically science or a scientific experience, but just having great teachers and having fun learning in school was the important thing for me.
Gotcha. So what first turned your attention then to the fields of engineering?
When I applied to colleges, I figured that I would do something in the science or engineering domain, in part because if you just look at the practical realities of the classes you have to take, I figured I better start there because if I change my mind and decide to become a lawyer or an interior decorator, it might be easier to go that direction than the other way around.
Sure.
And in various places I applied to, I actually applied in different majors. But when I wound up going to UC Berkeley for my bachelor's degree, I liked the idea of doing mechanical engineering because the way I pictured it was that while I loved physics, in the long term, it wasn't as clear to me how directly physics could impact people and change the world on a kind of immediate basis. Whereas in mechanical engineering, I learned quickly in my classes that I could be designing things, I could be impacting people's lives almost immediately. So there was that trade-off between the love of doing things that were fundamental versus doing something that could really help people. And the nice thing about engineering is I think you can do both, especially when you go on to a graduate career and become a professor. You can do things that are both fundamental and more immediately impactful.
Definitely. So did you have an opportunity as an undergraduate student to get some hands-on experience in the lab in engineering?
Yeah, I had a wonderful professor when I was at UC Berkeley, Dennis Liu, who encouraged me to join his laboratory as young as the summer after my freshman year.
Oh, that's awesome.
I got to be involved in research fairly early on, and some of it was actually looking at engineering education and how you teach. And some of it was also testing Taekwondo equipment. And I was on a Taekwondo club and competed in Taekwondo and doing research in terms of how the Taekwondo equipment could actually protect people.
Oh,
so
wow.
There was a lot of fun connections for me between things I was interested in and the engineering science behind them.
Very cool. Can you tell us then what happened after graduate school? I know you went straight into a faculty position. What was that like?
Intimidating. I would say when I was in graduate school, it wasn't even totally clear to me that I would go on to an academic position. I had worked part-time as a startup, and that was actually going to be my default. I also had trouble imagining myself as a faculty member, looking up to my own Ph.D. advisor, Mark Kikoski, who was fantastic, but it was hard for me to imagine being him and being in that role, which is obviously a difficult comparison to make when you're a student and you are being advised by a more senior person.
Right.
So I decided to do a faculty search ultimately because I was convinced by some programs for the potential future faculty that there'd be a cohort of people that would be kind of just like me. I didn't have to compare myself against others. So when I did interview for faculty jobs, that was probably the most inspirational thing because you get to visit different universities and imagine if I was here, these are the great people I could work with. This is the interesting research I could do. This is what's special about this environment. And when I eventually picked some place to start my faculty career, which was Johns Hopkins University, it was because there was this special spark of me, even though I hadn't done a postdoc, knowing that I was going to be well mentored, that I was going to have great colleagues that would help me along the way to learn the ropes. And that certainly turned out to be true at the beginning of my faculty career.
Excellent. And I'm intrigued by a comment that you made mentioning that you had gotten involved in a startup. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, when I was a graduate student, there was a local company that had spun out of Stanford called Immersion, which is no longer a startup. It's quite a large company now. Mm-hmm. And they saw one of my final projects for a course that I had worked on related to human-machine interaction through touch, and offered to have me do a little bit of part-time work for them, which sometimes turned into a lot of part-time work. And in the end, actually, working at that startup company had probably more of an influence on what I do now as a faculty member than what I actually did in my PhD thesis, which had more to do with robot touch, using robot hands and fingers rather than human-machine interaction.
Very cool. Well, Allison, great to hear more about your path. And I know, like I said, you have so many cool projects going on in the lab. It's probably hard to pick a favorite, but do you have one that you want to tell us more about today?
One of the things I'm most excited about, in part because it's new and it's different and it's something I'm still learning about, and my students as well, and that's this field of soft robotics. I mentioned that these soft robots can conform to their environment and be safe around humans. But another unique thing that we've been able to do with these soft robots is to create in them a sort of form of growth. So if you imagine a plant like a vine growing from one place in the garden over around rocks and around trees and even up trunks of trees, these vines have this amazing ability to get places where you can't ever imagine a classical robot, for example, on wheels ever going. But by creating these soft plastic robots where we can feed more material through the center of the robot, and then it gets sort of spit out the tip and the plastic just keeps growing and growing, you're basically able to create a vine-like robot that can get you from point A to point B. And what's exciting about it is not only that it's a whole new way of thinking about robotics and how robotics get from point A to point B, but it's also bio-inspired in that you can think about what are the different ways in which biology gets around. And while many robots are already inspired by animal life, thinking about how robots are inspired by plant life is pretty interesting.
Definitely. And I guess I'd never really considered these plant-inspired robots. Do you have some ideas of what these things could be potentially used for?
Absolutely. The thing I think they're most exciting for is search and rescue. So there are a lot of cases where you have rubble or dangerous scenarios after, for example, an earthquake or fire, and you need to be able to get in through very small holes, potentially deep into a building, maybe even tens of meters away. And these long, skinny, growing robots can get into those places, and they can do it in a way that's kind of gentle. So the idea is that you wouldn't disrupt the environment around you like you might if you had a more traditional hard robot. And then once you get there, you can feed air, you can feed water through the tube that you've essentially grown in that direction. And that means you've now made contact. You can put in sensors, for example, measure oxygen, measure temperature, and you can get all kinds of useful data back. And that's search and rescue. We can imagine medical applications like smaller versions of these that could be used in catheters. We've already made some which work as antennas that change their shape in order to change the frequencies at which they communicate. So it's sort of this paradigm of shape change that might let you have robots that do things that they normally wouldn't be expected to do.
Well, this is really exciting, Allison. So what is the next step in this particular project that you're working on now with soft robots?
For us, one of the exciting new projects that we've been doing has been thinking about how you use robots like this to be useful in other scientific fields. One example is archaeology. I had a student take one of these robots to Peru to use in an archaeological expedition last summer. And now we're talking to a conservation biologist on Stanford's campus about using them to explore the tunnels of some endangered species underneath the ground of our own campus.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. What sort of species?
California tiger salamanders.
Very cool. Well, Allison, the work you're doing is remarkable, and I think it has so many different potential applications, which is really exciting. And I like that you had mentioned previously that what you had wanted to do in thinking about your careers was something that would have an immediate impact. Is this something that you're able to see with your work today?
One of the exciting things about soft robots in particular is that they have the potential to be quite cheap and deployable in environments. Basically, they can just be made practical. So it's exciting to see things where there's a lot of basic research to be done, but fairly quickly we see that we can make something that's useful.
Well, that's really exciting. I think we've talked about thus far a lot of the great aspects of your career, but I think scientists, their careers come with a lot of challenges and struggles, and there's a lot of failures along the way. So, Allison, do you have a story about one of these failures that you can share with us and talk us through how you worked through it?
I would say it's not one moment or one event, but I'm sure many of your listeners have heard of the imposter syndrome. Mm-hmm. This is kind of a lifetime experience, really. For those that don't know, the imposter syndrome is this feeling, really, I guess, a psychological condition where you feel like you're an imposter. You don't deserve to be where you are because maybe you just got there because of luck or just hard work, but you're not actually as smart as other people might think you are. And the concern is that someday somebody will figure it out and realize you shouldn't have gotten into graduate school or you shouldn't have become a professor. And that's the imposter syndrome. And I would say it's definitely something I struggled with. As I mentioned before, it's kind of sad that despite having a great academic background and really the best preparation I think you could have for this kind of career, yet I would still internalize these feelings as many other people do, whether they admit it or not. So really, the struggle with imposter syndrome has just been one that has gotten slowly easier over the course of my career as you have successes, you gain confidence, or you even have failures, which is inevitable. But then you realize they're not ruinous. You can continue on with your life and your career will be just fine despite some of those setbacks. So I think the struggle that I had with imposter syndrome, and I will even say have today, because it never goes completely away, is simply one of adaptation. The only danger of it really is the additional stress or the fear that it can create to do something that might be risky or unusual. So it's been a struggle to try to do things that are maybe riskier or different in my career because of that. But as confidence builds up over time, it becomes a tool to think about, hey, am I not doing something just because I'm scared, or is it really not a good idea? So I can recognize that and start to be able to push the envelope more in terms of the type of things that I do.
Definitely. Well, Allison, thank you so much for sharing this. And I think you're absolutely right. So many people struggle with this imposter syndrome. And for our listeners out there, hearing that successful scientists like you have had these challenges and these second guessing yourself moments is really helpful and encouraging for them. And you mentioned a mindset that can help you get through it. Do you have any other tips or tricks or things that have helped you?
Well, I definitely think that having a community, people to bounce ideas off of, people to talk to, whether it's collaborators or whether it's my own students, that's the thing that really helps me not dwell on these kinds of feelings. So working together as a team really helps people, I believe, get past these sorts of feelings.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for sharing this story with us, Allison. We don't just want to focus on the failures and the challenges and the struggles. Can you tell us next about one of your exciting successes in science?
It's so funny. It's hard to pick one because especially if you think about the successes, they're not just mine, right? They're those of my students. So I think the things that I get most excited about in terms of successes are actually things that the students accomplish, right? Seeing students find their passion and success. And maybe without getting into too much detail, the thing that I really am most proud of is when I have a student who maybe comes from a disadvantaged background or is someone who might not have had the same opportunities that I did, that if I can provide them with those opportunities that they can achieve their dreams, whether it's a faculty position or whether it's a job in industry, no matter what it is, being able to show students what they can achieve for me is the biggest success. And in a way that's cheating because it's a success I get to live every year over and over as a faculty member. But it's also something I have to work at, right? Those kinds of successes don't just fall in your lap. It means that as a faculty member, you have to seek out people that aren't always going to be the obvious choice, but you see a spark and you know that you can develop something in them that could be extraordinary.
Definitely. And Allison, I think this point that you hinted at, that this teaching, the mentoring, the working with and helping develop students as scientists and engineers is a big part of your job. So can you talk a little bit about maybe some of your teaching experiences or what it's like to work in your lab?
Absolutely. Lab culture is a really important thing to me. And when I decide which students are going to work with, or I recruit them to try to get them to want to work with me, it's not just about what kind of grades they got in college or what sort of scores you got on a test. It's really about, wow, this is someone who's going to be part of my group for maybe 5 or 6 years. We're going to be working closely together for a really long time. And the PhD is also a hard track. There's a lot of uncertainty and that can create stress. So what I want to do is cultivate a group of people that have some diversity, that have come from different backgrounds, and that I will also enjoy learning from in the process of working together. So it's building that community that is challenging, but I think contributes to what, for me, makes being a professor enjoyable. So if you ask me what my career was, I don't know if I would really say scientist. I would say professor, which means we do science and we teach, and it's all mixed up together. It's impossible to separate those things.
Absolutely. Well, wonderful to hear more about the community that you're building in your laboratory and some of the successes that you've had in mentoring students and helping them get to the next stage of their careers. I think that's so important. And we talked a little bit about your life outside of science and engineering for a bit at the beginning of the interview. And I'd love to jump back out there next to talk a little bit about what you're reading. So Allison, do you have a favorite book that you'd like to recommend to me and our listeners, whether it's science related or not?
I'll pick one that's somewhat science related and even more so maybe engineering related. Probably one of the most enjoyable books that I read recently was The Martian by Andy Weir. It was also a movie.
Yeah.
And the idea is that there's an engineer who's also a botanist who becomes stuck on Mars and has to use all of his engineering ingenuity in order to survive for this long period on his own. And I think what I like about it, it has this sort of geeky aspect where they explain how he goes through the process of surviving, but also he's a human being and he has a sense of humor and is able to take what's really a difficult situation and make something interesting out of it.
Well, great book recommendation. I will say I've read it myself and I really enjoyed it as well. So listeners, definitely check out The Martian if you hadn't had a chance to read it yet. I'll put it on our reading list on our website for everyone to find there. And we've talked about different aspects of your career, Allison, but we haven't yet touched on some of the great opportunities that you get to travel as a scientist. So thinking back on all the places that you've been for conferences to work with colleagues, do you have a favorite or maybe most memorable place that you visited for your work?
I always feel like there's so many things to like and enjoy. It's always hard to pick one.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I'll pick one where I felt like it was a very unusual experience for me. And that would be when I got to attend last year the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. In part because it was a conference that's sort of held as a retreat at the snow-capped mountain in Switzerland. It's kind of hard to get to, and the town kind of shuts down for the period of this conference to accommodate it and all the people from all over the world that come. It's also something that pushes you outside of your comfort zone, or at least pushed me outside of my comfort zone, because the people that attend, of course, are not just scientists, but many of them are politicians, or economic leaders, or business people. And it was that whole combination of being in such a beautiful, unusual environment and learning from and talking to people who just came from very different backgrounds from my own and had different types of expertise was definitely one of the most unique travels I've had as a researcher.
That is awesome. So did you find it was maybe easier, where there were a lot of people maybe interested in the work that you were doing to have these conversations?
Yeah, actually, I was quite worried that no one was going to be interested in my little robotics research topic,
right.
But it's actually fantastic in a community like that, how interested people are in the kinds of future technologies that we're creating. And it was also a chance to have a lot of conversations that don't usually come up in my daily life about ethics of the kinds of things that we do. And although I'm not really directly an artificial intelligence researcher, this conversation has become more and more prominent about the role of robotics and whether they would take people's jobs versus help them and what this means for society and the future of work. That was probably the place where I first got to start really thinking and talking about it with people that were coming from the side of economics and business and the social sciences.
Very cool. And Allison, you mentioned that this meeting was held at this beautiful, picturesque location in Switzerland. So were you able to stay a little bit to sightsee?
So I did step out for a bit to go snowboarding.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's funny. Usually when I go on travel these days, my trips are as short as I can make them because I'm always in a rush to get back to my family to spend time with them. But I always try to step out for a little bit and enjoy the local place. And probably the best way to do that, although for me, not in the snow in Davos, but most other places, is to go for a run. And sometimes it's even fun to get together with running groups at a conference, other people that are attending the conference that don't even really know, but you can get together and go for a run and get to meet new people that way as well.
Very cool. Now, do you ever get to travel with your family to places?
It's pretty rare. Unfortunately, most conferences, the timing is going to be such that my kids are in school or my husband has to teach. So not as much as I like.
Sure.
But I think I'm looking forward to a time in my career, maybe where things are more flexible with the rest of my family. And then maybe we get to go more exciting places together. That said, we have our own family vacations, which is probably better than dragging them along.
Right. Well, Allison, great to hear about some of your world travels for the work that you're doing. And you've hinted at throughout our conversation some of the wonderful people you've been able to work with, all the way from mentors down to the students who are working with you. And I think the people in science and engineering are part of what makes these such wonderful careers. So I love talking about this human side of science and engineering and sharing some of the fun and funny stories and quirky anecdotes and just things that happen that are contrary to some of the stereotypes that people out there have about scientists and engineers. So do you have a story of your own that shows this human side of science that you can share with us?
I think one of my favorite things in our research lab are our CHARM pillows. I'll have to explain this a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So our laboratory is called the CHARM Lab. CHARM stands for Collaborative Haptics and Robotics in Medicine, and it's our acronym. In fact, I once had a collaborator that told us that was a disruptive name for an engineering research lab. Anyway, we like our name. But one of my earlier Ph.D. students, Ann Majovich, she was very handy, of course, not just in the lab, but also in sewing. So she made us a set of pillows shaped like Lucky Charms, the marshmallows in the cereal. So we have a set of pillows on our lab couch, which are charm pillows. You have your rainbow and your pot of gold.
The red balloons or something. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have these charm pillows in different shapes that look like the Lucky Charms cereal. And I love that as an example of my lab because it kind of gets away from the sort of stiff nature that people think about when they think about robotics. And it emphasizes the creativity and sort of hands-on can-do abilities that we have in this field.
I love it. Now, are you the crafty hands-on sort yourself as well?
Sometimes. Actually, we recently had our Halloween celebration, and I made my costume to be bubble tea, which is the Taiwanese milk tea that has these boba tapioca balls in them.
Ooh.
So I like to make my own Halloween costumes, help my kids with theirs, things like that. And I would also say bubble tea and an obsession with that particular drink is also a current lab quirk.
I like it. I must say I'm also fond of bubble tea myself, but I'm trying to envision, how did you make a costume to look like bubble tea?
Well, I'm not sure it looked like that much like bubble tea. A lot of people ask me what I was. But basically, we took foam balls, spray painted them dark brown as the boba or the tapioca balls, and I put them into a kind of mesh skirt that I fashioned that was the color of milk tea.
Very cool.
And my 13-year-old daughter made me a straw that I could wear on a headband sticking out of my head.
That is amazingly creative. I like it, Allison. Well, thanks for sharing some of these lab traditions and quirks. And I think you're absolutely right. It's fun to break these stereotypes and go against the mold of what people think of in sort of the stiff, stuffy engineering laboratory environment and do something charming, like you said. So we've talked about some of the great work that you're doing in your lab and some of the big questions that you're working to address through some of the robots that you're creating. But I think oftentimes things stand in the way between scientists or engineers and the ultimate questions they would like to ask or the problems they'd like to solve. So if we gave you everything today, Allison, all of the funding, the staff, the technology, the feasibility, whatever you need, what is the one question that you most want to answer?
I think it's something we haven't really touched on yet much in this conversation, and it has to do with this field of haptics. The word haptics means anything having to do with the sense of touch. And our goal in many of the devices that we design for the students in my lab that do that is to create wearable or holdable devices that stimulate the skin in ways that give the illusion of feeling an object that isn't actually there. The challenge is that right now, the way in which we create these stimulations are through mechanical devices that we design that people wear. But what would be great, but also challenging and require a really large group of interdisciplinary collaborators, is to understand more fundamentally, how do you create haptic illusions? What is it? What is in my head that gives me the idea that I've created a particular sensation? So if we could understand something more fundamentally about the brain and how that gives rise to a haptic sensation so that we could basically optimize how we stimulate the human body, whether it's through mechanical means or electrical means, so that we could generate these virtual worlds that are much more realistic than we can today. That would be a lot of fun. And that's kind of a dream because it would take such a large group of interdisciplinary researchers working together to make such a thing happen.
Definitely. And in thinking about this, I think part of the challenge is there's so many different types of haptic sensations that you might have, and thinking about where those might be applied, whether it's virtual reality for entertainment purposes, or if you're thinking about like medical or surgical training, things like that.
Absolutely. There are all kinds of things related to training and guidance and also entertainment. But you can also think as augmented reality becomes more of a reality. How do you have virtual meetings? How do you share physical objects in these virtual environments? These are the kinds of things that you would need much better haptics than we have today for in order to make them truly effective.
Definitely. Well, Allison, thanks for dreaming big with us today and giving me and our listeners something to think about today. And we've talked about some different aspects of your career. And one of the things that we touched on are the great mentors and the people that you've had to inspire you and encourage you throughout your path. But I love for you to pass on to our listeners a little bit of inspiration or advice. So is there one piece of advice that you received at one point that really helped you that you can share with them today?
Well, as I mentioned, I had these wonderful mentors when I started as a faculty member. And when you're first getting started, one of the things that you tend to worry about is money for your research. So you start thinking about what are the types of grant proposals that I can write that are most likely to get funded. And then I realized when I was doing that they were not particularly successful. If my goal in writing research grants was to get funded, I wasn't necessarily writing the kinds of grants that would get funded. So I got great advice from senior colleagues, and this applies to also the tenure process that academic faculty go through, as well as writing grant proposals, is that you have to do what you're passionate about. You don't want to get money to do something that you're not actually interested in, and you don't want to get tenure for having made a career and an impact of something that you don't really love doing or believe in. So really just the advice that, and this is maybe a luxury that we have in academics, that we can dream about what it is that we want to do. And if you truly want to be successful, writing a grant proposal that's about something that you really want to do for the sake of doing it is going to be much more successful. And then you'll actually be happy when you get to do it.
Definitely. And Allison, I'm so glad you brought this up because I think, especially for new investigators, it can be hard to pursue your passions because you're worried about taking those risks with grants, whether it's concerns about getting some sort of stable funding that you can depend on to start your research program, or just that imposter syndrome sort of creeping in again in putting forth a risky or big idea kind of application.
Yes, exactly.
Well, wonderful message for our listeners, Allison. Is there anything else you'd like to share with them in terms of advice or a final message?
Well, I think one of the interesting things when you look at someone that's further along in their career, and this was probably part of my imposter syndrome issue when I was a student, is I just want to say that don't think that I was destined to do what I'm doing now. I could be a lawyer or an interior decorator. I could have any career. And I actually could imagine that I would be happy and potentially good at doing other things. So while I love what I'm doing, it's just not inevitable. None of it is. It's not based necessarily on some inherent destiny, but it's a series of choices and sometimes somewhat random opportunities and luck that ultimately result in me being where I am today. And it's just interesting when people look at the resume of someone that's very accomplished. It seems like it was an obvious path to get there. But when you're on that path, it's not obvious at all. So don't ever try to follow exactly someone else's path because it's the one that almost randomly potentially happened to them. And everyone needs to find their own path, and it might not end up where they expect.
Definitely. Well, that is a great point to bring up because I think you're absolutely right. And even so many of the guests we've had on our show, when they talk about their career path, in hindsight, it sounds like everything fell into place and everything was just meant to be that way. And that was the one path for them. But there are so many different forks in the road that you come to and decision points where you could have done so many different things. But I think ultimately, if you're passionate about it and you're pursuing something you're excited about, you're going to get to a good outcome. So great message for our listeners. Can you tell them if they want to learn more, Allison, about you and the wonderful work that you're doing, where should they go or how should they get in touch?
Our laboratory website is charm.stanford.edu. So CHARM, CHRARM, which is our lab acronym for Collaborative Haptics and Robotics in Medicine.
Excellent. Well, listeners, definitely check out the website. Allison has so many cool projects that she didn't yet have a chance to chat about today. So check those out and get in touch if you have questions. And Allison, thank you so much for joining us on the program and sharing a piece of your story.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Well, it was a pleasure to chat with you. And listeners, great to have you here with us as well. We'll see you next time on another episode of